Today I'm out here on this very misty morning to be controversial because, like many people, when I first saw this modern crop of coupified SUVs, that's what Mercedes is calling the GLE right next to me. This is the 2021 GLE Coupe. I thought they were insane. This is the least practical format for an SUV possible because it doesn't have a boxy rear end. But then it occurred to me recently that what we're really seeing is the reinvention of the modern sedan. The GLE 63S Coupe sitting right next to me is simply better, in my opinion, than the E63S. And I know that a lot of people are thinking that I'm insane at this point in time. Because yes, the GLE 63 is not going to handle like an E63, but it's going to do just about everything better than the sedan. And you know what? I'm not alone. According to Mercedes, the GLE outsells the E-Class by an enormous margin in the United States. And according to my local Mercedes dealer, the GLE Coupe specifically outsells the E-Class, at least on his lot, even though this is $10,000 more than the E63. I certainly love the way the E-Class sedan looks, but I think it's easy to see why the GLE sells better. It's a bit more practical, we have towing ability, we have 7.5 inches of ground clearance even in this sporty model, and we have a much bigger and more imposing front end look. The GLE Coupe is wider and taller and a little bit longer than the E-Class sedan, and it just has a presence that you don't find in a typical modern sedan. We have this absolutely enormous grille up front with that big Mercedes logo. Let me know how you want to look at the GLE Coupe down there in the comment section. Is this a significantly less practical, a highly compromised GLE, or is it a simply more practical version of the E-Class? Remember that the E-Class and the GLE are relatively closely related under the skin. They're not identical, but they do have a lot of common design elements, and they have exactly the same drivetrains under the hood. Now, I am in full agreement with crossover coupe detractors on just one critical point: the name. The name is stupid. Crossover coupe, it makes no sense because we have 3 too many doors back here. We have regular rear doors, and they still have a frame around the windows, and we have a 5th door in the back because this is a hatchback, so 3 too many doors to call this a coupe. But BMW basically does the same thing with the BMW X6. That is this vehicle's most direct competitor from Germany. At least in a classic sense it would be, but I really think that the most direct competitor to the GLE Coupe is the Mercedes-Benz E-Class, which is why I'm mainly going to be talking about the E-Class in this video, and I'll save the X6 comparison towards the end. Versus the E-Class, you'll notice that we do have a tiny little vestigial trunk. This is something that was seen in a lot of Mercedes coupe designs. Rather than trying to give us a really bulbous hatchback or direct sportback rear end, they give us sort of a little homage to a trunk, I guess you could say, back here, making this look a little bit more like a sedan from some angles. But there's still a lot of GLE in this design, and you can see that the rear end of the vehicle is definitely bulky. You can see how high this rear end is off the ground, even though it has sort of this sedan or liftback-like profile. It comes nearly up to my shoulder, and we have huge wheels and tires. On this vehicle, we have Pilot Sport 4S summer tires. They're a staggered setup, so we have the wider tires in the rear, 325s in the back, 285s up front. Absolutely massive on both sides. And these wheels are pretty big, 22-inch wheels. These would look a little bit silly on some sedans, but for a vehicle the size of the GLE, it sort of works. As you'd expect, we have positively massive multi-piston brakes up front, slotted and cross-drilled rotors in the front. And in the back, we have some AMG brakes that look a little bit small simply because of the size of this wheel and tire. But honestly, AMG performance sedans from just about 10 years ago would have been happy to see brakes this big in the front. In the back, we have a clean and simple design with full LED tail lamps, just as you'd expect in a vehicle that starts over $115,000. In this configuration, this one is $127,000. Below, we have 4 exhaust tips with an active exhaust system, well-integrated parking sensors, and as we see in other Mercedes models, the release for the hatch is right there inside the Mercedes logo. And then we have a liftback or sportback design rather than a traditional hatch like you'd find in the GLE. This means that we have less practicality than the GLE. The biggest difference between these two vehicles is right back here, but far more practicality than you'd find in an E-Class sedan. Since the 5-door coupe version of the GLE is supposed to be the sporty version, this only comes in AMG forms. We have the GLE 53 and the GLE 63S. The 53 gets one of Mercedes' newest engines. It's a 3-liter inline-6 engine with a mild hybrid system that produces 429 horsepower. Then we get this engine here, a 4-liter twin-turbo V8, also with a mild hybrid system on it, producing 603 horsepower and 627 pound-feet of torque. In addition to the mild hybrid system, this model also has a really aggressive cylinder deactivation system. You'll be really surprised how often this engine is driving along in 4-cylinder mode, and thanks to the mild hybrid system that can help torque fill, it's not as noticeable as other V8s that have this particular feature on it. This engine is mated to a 9-speed automatic transmission and standard Mercedes 4MATIC all-wheel drive. This particular system has a limited slip axle in the rear and the ability to send 100% of engine power to the rear. So if you don't want any power going to the front, there are drive modes that will enable that to happen. As you might expect, this is essentially the same drivetrain we find in the E63S, but because this is in a bigger, heavier vehicle, we lose 1 mile per gallon on the combined score, dropping this down to 17 mpg. Cargo capacity will vary depending on the rear seat option that you get. If you get the sliding rear seats, then you have the option of moving the second row forward to get up to 39.3 cubic feet of storage space. If you don't, you get 33.3. But any way you slice it, that is nearly 3 times the cargo capacity you'll find in the E-Class sedan at 13.1. And you won't really be able to fit a barbecue in an E-Class sedan. You could in an E-Class wagon, but I think this form factor is definitely sexier than the E-Class wagon. I know as an automotive journalist, I'm supposed to say that wagons are the be-all and end-all of automotive design, but this particular design has actually started to grow on me a little bit, even though, again, I keep being conflicted, thinking that this is impractical for a crossover. But if you look at this as a sedan alternative, then I think it makes more sense. Now, the one thing I'm not the biggest fan of is this cargo cover. It's a hard cargo cover. It folds into 3 sections right like that. This is going to make the interior quieter than a lot of roller type cargo covers, but it does mean that sticking it somewhere is going to be a little bit tricky if you want to use this cargo area on a spur of the moment trip to Home Depot or something. Under the load floor, we have a bit of a unicorn, a spare tire. We don't typically find those in performance sedans anymore, and even performance crossovers don't always have them. This is one of those silly inflatable spare tires. It'll actually go out to about here once it's fully inflated. There's a little tire inflator kit right there in the middle. This is a lot more practical than not having one at all, but a little bit less practical than a real full-size spare. In the Alex on Auto's exclusive Trunk Comfort Index, the GLE Coupe has to score lower than the regular GLE, so I'm going to give this 7 out of 10 points, but obviously more comfortable than the average sedan. A nice touch is that since this vehicle has an air suspension, there's a little control over here on this side to lower the rear end of the vehicle down so it's easier to load cargo in the back. One thing you should know is that the rear end of this vehicle is an awful lot higher than the average sedan, and actually quite a bit higher than some crossovers as well, so loading cargo into the back can be a little bit trickier. Improving cargo practicality is a touch that we see in a lot of European vehicles, which is a 40-20-40 folding rear seat back. This is a lot more practical than the typical 60-40 designs. Front seat comfort is excellent in this trim. The driver's seat and the front passenger seat have the same range of motion. They're both heated and ventilated, and they both have the optional massage feature. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a decent range of motion. It's memory linked to the 3-position memory over there on the driver's door. The passenger seat also has a 3-position memory. Versus the boxier GLE, legroom figures are pretty similar. Headroom figures change around a little bit because the roofline is different in this model, really sloping down there towards the rear passenger area. But oddly enough, any way you slice it, you'll find more headroom in here than we find in the E-Class sedan. We also find more of a crossover or SUV-like driving position. This seat bottom cushion is all the way down on the ground. That's how I prefer it, but you could raise it up and get an even more upright seating position if you were interested in one. We also have a windshield design, and just everything about the interior feels a lot like the E-Class, but a little bit higher off the ground, a little bit more, I guess you'd say, truck-like. For some people, that will make getting in and out of the vehicle a little bit easier than the sedan because the H-point is a little bit higher, and it also means you get a better view of the road. This model does not have the optional adjusting rear seats, which means I cannot move these seats forward and backward to give the cargo area a little bit more room, but that's certainly an option that I would select. Scooting fully into the middle here, you'll notice that the back seat is definitely a little bit wider than the E-Class. So if you're thinking about fitting adults and child seats or a bunch of child seats in the back, this is going to be a lot more accommodating. And any way you slice it, again, more headroom is found in here. In the middle, I have about 2 inches of headroom, which is pretty amazing. We get a little bit less if I sit in the outboard seating position because of the way the roofline curves in, but with my head back there to the headrest, I still have about 1.5 inches of room. So even though this is less practical than the regular GLE, this is significantly more cargo and passenger practical than something like an E-Class sedan or a BMW 5 Series, or really any mid-size luxury sedan at all. Now let's go for a quick look around the interior. We have a large pane of glass right here above the driver and front passengers' heads. It extends to just over the rear passengers' knees, but importantly, this does not open. It's simply a glass moonroof. We have red seat belts for all 5 passengers, 4-way adjustable headrests for the driver and front passenger, and again, these front seats are heated, ventilated, and massaging. They also have adjustable inflatable bolsters, and you can see pretty aggressive bolstering down there on the seat bottom cushion as well. As with many Mercedes models, there are a ton of different interior color combinations, materials choices, leather choices, etc., and a lot of trim choices as well. One thing that I really like is that in Mercedes high-performance models, you can get real wood trim if you want to. On this particular model, it appears that we have woven metal on this trim. So this looks kind of like carbon fiber, but it's not actually carbon fiber. We have the Burmester audio system right there, the controls for the passenger seat, and you can see all of the ambient lighting going on here. It is on a color wheel mode, so there are a wide variety of different color modes you can choose from on this ambient lighting, and this particular one is in a mode where it color changes. We have a stitched leather dashboard, big speaker grills up there, and this enormous two-screen setup that we see in a wide variety of different Mercedes models. These screens are each a little over 12 inches. It's not one screen, there's actually a little bit of a divider between the two screens right there. The infotainment screen is a touch screen. It supports Apple CarPlay and other smartphone integration. And then the other screen is, of course, just a regular screen because it's the instrument cluster. 4 large air vents right there, the controls for the automatic climate control system. Under here, we have a large cup holder setup, Qi wireless charging mat, USB port for the infotainment system, USB charge only port. Mercedes really loves USB-C ports, so we find 2 of them right in there. Then behind that, we have a very similar center console to the regular GLE, ambient lighting going on in there with these big hand grips right there. A controller for the infotainment system. You can either use the touchscreen, you can use the controller on the steering wheel, or you can use this touchpad. There are also some additional buttons around for the drive mode, the infotainment system right there, some direct access buttons to various features. And then we have all of the various AMG controls right back here. A manual mode, stability and traction control off, control for the air suspension, control for the damping, that's different from the air height right there. And then you can make the exhaust louder with that little button. Behind that, we have a bifold storage area. Those sides close, and it gives us a softly padded leather-wrapped armrest. The LCD instrument cluster is highly configurable. It's controlled via these controls over here on the left side of the steering wheel. This center little control is sort of like the little nub that we found on 1990s Blackberries. You use it to interact with this system. So I can choose an option, then click down on it, and get one of the other displays right there, the other themes for this large LCD instrument cluster. This is one of the more adjustable LCD clusters available in this segment. The only thing it's really missing is satellite imagery like we find in modern Audi products. We then have this large AMG steering wheel. It has a flat bottom, 3 spokes right there, paddle shifters as you'd expect on the back, nice big meaty ones over here down on the left, up over there on the right. The nearly identical controller over here on the right side controls the LCD infotainment system. We then have controls for the infotainment system over here, but you'll notice no track forward backward. I do think that's an odd misstep. If you want to track forward backward, you have to use this little swipey controller right here, or use the other controls in the infotainment system. We then have a drive mode knob right there that allows us to choose between a variety of different drive modes. We then have configurable controls over here on this side. If I click the LCD portion, you can see that it scrolls through some various options there, and then to enable and disable the option, I click the button next to it. Same thing happens for this one up here, so you can choose what each of these little buttons does. Then over here on this side, we have the controls for the adaptive cruise control system. Because this is the AMG model, the individual drive mode offers us way more options than you'll find in the average Mercedes. You can see right here the way the engine behaves there, tons of different options, transmission, manual and drive right there, dynamics. We have these options here that basically controls the way the stability and traction control system works, suspension damping right there, and then we can move down to the exhaust system and we can choose basically normal or a little bit louder. One thing that surprises me is that we don't have controls for the auto start-stop system in that infotainment system. You'll find it right down there next to the engine start-stop button. The reason I find that interesting is because this is a hybrid, albeit a mild hybrid, it does spend a reasonable amount of time with the engine off. You see right now auto start-stop is activated there, but because we have a relatively large lithium-ion battery and an electric air conditioning compressor, the air conditioning is still cranking out nice cold frosty air even when the engine is stopped. That means that this system is going to have a bigger positive impact on your fuel consumption in southern states where you can actually leave this system on when you're at stoplights. Out on the road, this has solid performance credentials. 0 to 60 in 3.6 seconds, 60 back to 0 in 104 feet. Those are numbers that, honestly, an E-Class AMG would have been proud of 10 years ago. Now, the trick, of course, is that the E63 is currently much, much faster than this. 0 to 60 in that model happens between 2.7 and 2.8 seconds, depending on who's tested it. So any way you slice it, this is going to be slower, and it will take extra time to stop from 60 miles an hour to 0, but the performance is breathtaking. 603 horsepower in anything is going to be a ton of fun. This also has really wide tires and an excellently designed suspension, so This will do things that you would think no SUV should ever be able to do. No vehicle with 7.5 inches of ground clearance at the very, very least. Remember that the E-Class is going to be about 1,000 pounds lighter than this, nearly 1,000 pounds different, and it's going to be a lot closer to the ground. The version that I'm testing weighs nearly 5,400 pounds. And remember, this has an adaptive height air suspension system, so things are a little bit different than your average high-level performance sedan, just in terms of the general mission of this vehicle. That means that logically, this is not going to pull as many Gs on a skid pad. I don't have access to one, but folks that do have rated this just over 0.9 Gs. However, you will get just over 1 G in an E63S. That is an absolutely mind-blowing performance sedan, or of course, mind-blowing performance wagon if you get that version. But everything else about this GLE is incredible, and to be perfectly honest, most folks won't notice too much of a difference if you're not out on a track, because if you're just out in your favorite fun winding mountain road, you will be able to go much faster in this than you logically should be going out on a road surface like this. And even though you theoretically could go a little bit faster in an E63, would you? As far as high-performance SUVs go, you will find a few options that will handle a little bit better than the GLE 63, but not very many, so I'm certainly going to give this an A when it comes to handling. This is just an absolute blast to drive out on your favorite road, whether it's straight or whether it's really windy in the mountains like this one. When the roads get a little bit narrower and really begin to wind like the one that I'm on here, you will certainly notice the extra size of the GLE versus the E-Class. This is only about an inch longer than the E-Class, but it is notably wider, and you will certainly notice that. You'll also notice that the GLE has a little bit more of a, I guess you'd say, grown-up feel to it out on the road. This feels a little bit bigger, a little bit heavier, a little bit softer, not quite as sharp as the E-Class, but in an odd sort of way, I prefer the way that the GLE is tuned. This feels a little bit more my style. Not everybody has exactly the same thing in mind when they're thinking about their ideal ride tuning, and for me, something that definitely has a sporty bend to it, but also is daily driver comfortable and livable, is certainly my preference, and that exactly describes the GLE. One of the best things about the GLE is the standard air suspension. Even in comfort mode, this is not going to be as supple as the GLE 53 or the lower end versions of the regular GLE without the coupe-like profile in the rear, but this is still eminently daily driver livable. Out on a rough gravel road like this is the kind of vehicle where I would not have a problem driving for 20, 30, 40 minutes out on a road surface like this if I needed to. This does have a little bit of off-road ability, obviously. We do have some off-road modes here, which is kind of hilarious. We have, let's see here, we go through this little wheel, we have sand, we have trail. I suppose I could put this in trail right now. There's also slippery for icy situations, snowy situations, etc. We have an adjustable height functionality in this vehicle in addition to adaptive damping. This vehicle has both of those features. Versus something like the E63S, the sedan, or the station wagon, this is an awful lot more comfortable. It also feels a bit more substantial, as I said before. You'll really notice that out on a rougher road surface like this, where this glides over the road imperfections a little bit better than the sedan does. Bearing in mind that this vehicle has wide 325 with summer tires in the back, I measured an impressive 69.5 decibels in here at 50 miles an hour. That makes this one of the quieter luxury crossovers, pretty close to what we see in the BMW X5. So when it comes to cabin quietness, I'm going to give this an A. Now there is something you should know. This has an optional extra sound insulation package on it. So if you don't get that, it's probably going to be louder in here. If you're planning on getting the widest tires available and the grippiest tires available, I would strongly recommend the extra sound insulation, even though it adds a little bit of extra weight to the vehicle. This already weighs nearly 5,400 pounds. The extra weight's not really going to be too much of a problem, but it is going to improve the cabin quietness. As far as fuel economy goes, I've been averaging 17.2 miles per gallon, which is right around what the EPA says you should be getting. One thing that's really impressed me is the amount of time that this vehicle spends in 4-cylinder drive mode. This is a lot more aggressive at entering 4-cylinder mode than the vast majority of vehicles out there with a cylinder deactivation system, except for some of the newer GM vehicles. And I think that has to do with the hybrid system. The hybrid system's electric motor helps augment the vehicle's torque delivery. So in situations where you need just a little bit more torque, but you don't really need to spin the engine up too much, the harmonics created by a cylinder deactivation system would be a little bit negative. So this system can then instead use the electric motor to give you that extra torque without having to create those additional harmonics. It allows you to stay in that fuel saving mode just a little bit longer. Bottom line, out on the road, this does not drive exactly like an E63. This is certainly going to take longer to get 0 to 60. It's about 1,000 pounds heavier, but keep in mind, this will tow over 7,000 pounds and an E63 won't. But I think that's actually a fine trade because the rest of the driving dynamics in this vehicle are exactly my taste. Now it's time to talk pricing, so those of you with a gentle disposition might want to sit down. Remember that the GLE Coupe comes only in AMG trims, starting with the GLE 53. That's going to start at $76,500. That is notably more expensive than the more practical GLE and more expensive than the comparable Mercedes-Benz E-Class as well. If you want this version, this is the GLE 63S with 603 horsepower from its twin-turbo V8. This started at $116,000, and this particular vehicle is lightly equipped at $126,190. That is including the pesky destination charge on this particular vehicle. This one includes $2,000 upgraded wheels, the $1,100 optional massaging package, and the $1,100 acoustic package, which I think is worth it on this particular vehicle because we have really wide summer tires and the interior could get noisy. This is definitely quieter than the regular GLE Coupe in our testing. The $1,100 acoustic package adds additional insulation all around the vehicle and it helps compensate for the much wider tires that we have on this model. I would say if you're going to look at the 63S version of the GLE Coupe, definitely get the acoustic upgrade package. Over the last few years, automotive journalists have been wringing their hands over the death of the sedan in America. But customers have spoken, and customers have said that they're looking for vehicles like this, even vehicles like this GLE 63 Coupe. They like the sedan format perhaps on the outside, but they're after SUV or crossover-like practicality and functionality on the inside. They want something that's a little bit higher off the ground. They want a bigger, more practical cargo area. When you think about it, a sedan has a relatively impractical cargo area, a tiny little hatch right here or perhaps a little slot where you could fit a few bags in. This is the kind of vehicle where if you want to go to Home Depot and buy a barbecue or just something big, whatever that might be, you can put it in the back of the vehicle yourself rather than paying to have it delivered like people used to have to do when they simply had a trunk in the back. Be sure and let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section. Head over to the merch store at aoamerch.com. You can find me over at facebook.com/AlexNautos, Instagram, Twitter, all those other social places. And I'll end this video by saying, the sedan is dead, long live the sedan. And if you notice in the background, there is another sedan crossover back there, and that is the Ford Mustang Mach-E. Ford would love to tell you that that is a SUV, it's the Mustang SUV. Some might also try and claim it's a four-door coupe, just like this GLE, but the two vehicles are actually really targeting a very similar shopper, someone that wants the practicality of 4 doors and a lift back, but they don't want to call it a sedan. They don't want to call it a liftback. They want to call it a crossover or an SUV or whatever it is that you want to call this. Call it the 21st century sedan. Any way you slice it, I think this is quite simply better than the E63. Let me know how I am wrong down there in the comment section. I'm sure you all will, and I'll see all of you later.